It's the Sunrise Morning Show. I'm Anna Mitchell, joined by Jeff Cavins, and he's got a new book out from Servant Books called When You Suffer, Biblical Keys for Hope and Understanding. Jeff, good morning.
Good morning. Good to be with you, Anna.
Why did you feel the need to write a book about suffering?
Well, because I was suffering. And the actual truth of the matter is that's right. Over the years, in teaching Bible, I started to become aware that there are certain topics in the Bible that people want answers for, but they don't have them. And one of them is the meaning of suffering in their life. And everybody's going to suffer. The question isn't if you're going to suffer, it's when, and more to the point, how are you going to suffer? And so suffering is one of those topics that everybody is dealing with, whether it's in their family, marriage, their health, finances, their emotional well-being, and simple little answers don't cut it. Right. People want to know, in the end, is there any meaning to this? Is this a waste in my life? And if Jesus suffered for me, then why in the world do I have to suffer? So it really caught my attention about 12 years ago when I had a very serious neck injury, and my C6-7 in my spine actually broke. It split. And I went through 9 months of just agony in pain. And during that time, my good friend Scott Hahn and I, we would talk almost daily on the phone about suffering. And I was very familiar with that phrase, offer it up. My mother would say, I was growing up, offer it up. And that basically meant, get out of the kitchen, I'm cooking, But I knew that phrase, but to be honest with you, Anna, I didn't know theologically really the inner workings of why that works, why we should do it. And so I had been studying this for over a decade, and I finally decided that it's time for me to really write a book that is both theological and incredibly practical.
Well, how does it feel as somebody who studies the history of salvation for a living, who teaches the history of salvation for a living? How do you feel knowing that you can actually participate in salvation through your suffering?
Well, it's very powerful to suddenly realize that all of the work that Jesus did for us is for us, but that all of the work that he did for us, he invites us to participate with him. And this is one of the differences between Catholic theology and the early church and the modern American notion of Christianity, where Jesus did it all, and I just receive, and I'm a king's kid, and I don't have to suffer. And we've heard that type of gospel on television. Problem with that is that it's, number one, not biblical. Right. Number two, it's not reasonable. And number three, I would say it's incredibly American. Look, there's two ways of looking at this. One is that Jesus did everything, and all I have to do now is receive the good stuff. I have allocated Jesus to the tougher job of the cross and suffering, and I just take all the goods. The problem with that, as I said, is it's not biblical. The second perspective is, yes, he did everything, but now as sons and daughters, he invites us to participate in his mission. So, for example, Jesus is the one intercessor between God and men. We know that. That's what is written in the New Testament. Yet he shares his intercessory role with us when he says, pray for one another. He is the good shepherd, yet he shares that shepherding role with pastors, with the priests that we have. He is the judge, but he clearly says that one day we will be judging with him. He's the healer, yet he says, lay hands on the sick, and they will recover. So he's sharing everything about his mission with us, and suffering isn't any different. So he suffered for the sins of the world, yet Paul says in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 24, I rejoice in my suffering for your sake, and I complete in my body that which is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. So what could be lacking in the sufferings of Christ? Well, nothing except our participation. We have been given a small particle of the infinite treasury of God's redemptive suffering. We've been given a little particle, and St. John Paul II says we can apply that to people, and then we find that our suffering joined to Christ becomes salvific, it's redemptive, and we participate with him in redeeming the world. We participate with him, Anna, in this loving of the world. So, the bottom line is that suffering gives us the opportunity to love as Christ loves and to experience the exchanges of love in the Trinity. It's an amazing opportunity, but one that's often wasted.
Yeah, and I mean this wholeheartedly, that the Catholic Church's teaching on suffering is my favorite part of being Catholic, other than the Eucharist, which is
you and I are totally together there.
And yet we look at the world, and the presence of suffering in our world is what so many people cite for why they don't believe in God.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question, and it's kind of the other side of the coin. That if suffering joined with Christ is so valuable, it's heavenly cash, if you will, it's so valuable, then why is there so much suffering in the world, and what is our role as a church to relieve suffering? If it's so good, why relieve it?
Right.
And this is the two sides of the same coin. Yes, we do participate with Christ. Christ did suffer for the world. He suffered for the world, not that the world would continue to suffer forever, but that we would have our sins dealt with through his suffering. Our suffering can mean something joined to him in terms of relieving the suffering of the world. St. John Paul II said it so well. He said, there's two kinds of suffering. There is physical suffering and there is moral suffering, the suffering of the heart. That's two types. There's also two kinds. There's temporal suffering and what he calls definitive suffering, which is to be without God forever and ever and ever. So what Jesus did is he utilized physical and moral suffering in the temporal time period here to deal with that definitive suffering. We're not meant to suffer forever. We're not meant to live with our bodies falling apart forever. Jesus came to address definitive suffering. And this question that you bring up of, if God loved us so much, why is there so much suffering in the world? That isn't because of God. That is because of original sin. That's because of what happened with our original parents, Adam and Eve. It is unfortunate that there's that much suffering in the world, but it means that we as Catholics should double our efforts to pray for people, to bring relief to the suffering in the world, and to not waste our own suffering, but to love as Christ loved, to pick up our cross daily and follow him.
Jeff, let's get practical today. You said there was practicality in your book. So what are some practical ways to deal with your suffering?
Well, I think that one of the things that we can do with our suffering, first of all, when we offer it up, it's not magic. It's not just saying, I offer it up. It's really embracing and utilizing your will. And what you're doing is you're doing the same thing that Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. He went into the Garden of Gethsemane and he said, Father, if there's another way, let's do it. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And so the human will of Jesus was always in lockstep with the divine will of his Father. And what we have to do in our own suffering is not waste it, but to see it as an opportunity to love and participate in the redeeming of the world. And so often we run from our suffering. We hide from it. Now, I'm not saying you can't take an Aleve or Advil or anything else. That's silly. But we oftentimes, when we suffer, we end up self-medicating, running. We blame other people. And it's time for us as Christians to grow up, to pick up our cross, and in a practical way say, I am going to join my suffering with the suffering of Christ. And when you do that, Anna, when you say, I offer up my suffering in union with Christ, something happens to your suffering. St. John Paul II said, even your suffering is redeemed. He makes all things new. And Jesus is not